for research, documentation, and publication. She's worked again on peace building in Kosovo for many years. And so we have 4 different people coming from 4 different disciplinary backgrounds, 4 different societies. And I think we heard this morning when Kunda Dixit told us that just because violence ends, we haven't actually savored or discovered peace. And I think the 4 members of the panel are going to look at different histories, different life stories, looking both at individual trauma, but also looking at collective trauma and collective healing. So I'm going to start with Kosovo, with Bosnia first. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the current context is in Bosnia, how people have responded to the previous violence, and what steps perhaps you have taken towards building a sustainable peace.
Yeah, in Bosnia's situation, the war stopped in Bosnia in 1995. It was stopped by the international intervention and peace agreement written by the international community and signed by war leaders, basically, from all countries in the region that were involved in war. It stopped in 1995 after genocide was committed in Srebrenica and after 120,000 people were killed, mostly civilians. And before that, it was a war that in Europe especially is known as the war that will remember the city of Sarajevo as a city with the longest siege in modern history. That was the city that I'm coming from. I still live in Sarajevo. I survived the war in Sarajevo in Bosnia. Today, after 20 or something years, Bosnia is still semi-protectorate. That's the only semi-protectorate together with Kosovo, I think, probably in the world. I think Bosnia is much bigger than it is in Kosovo. We still have a high representative who is appointed by the international community. He has ultimate power in Bosnia, meaning that he can sack any politician from any position. And until today, a couple of hundreds of politicians, including some presidents, were sacked from their position. International community in Bosnia can impose any law and basically can interfere in any sphere of life, of public life in Bosnia, including media, including art, including literally everything. Unlike at the end of the war, people in Bosnia do communicate a lot. We are in contact a lot. We are trying to find our own way how to deal with the past. International community is present also in that field. I don't see that their presence is helping us a lot, but it's there, and we have to find a way to kind of reconcile also with international community, with ourselves, with the region, with everything. So how is the situation today in Bosnia? Bosnia is one of the 20 poorest countries in the world. All the others are, except Kosovo, are African countries. We have 64% of unemployment among youth. General unemployment officially is 27%. Unofficially is around 40%, since many people work in a grey economy. And when it comes to the war, war remains actually like fear-mongering and the reminding of war and fears that we felt during the war and all the horrible things that we went through during the war is the main arms for local politicians and the international community in Bosnia to keep a status quo and to keep people believing that we should be afraid of each other, because only if we are afraid of each other and if we believe that we hate each other, that's the only way to keep the status quo, and that's the only way to have the same politicians. Until today, we have the same politicians as we have them during the war. Actually, one of them died, but his son inherited his position. So we have 3 presidents, we have 158 ministers, we have 10 cantons, 2 entities, and 1 district. So that's Bosnia today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those thoughts. So we'll come back to the issues of international involvement, economic justice and prosperity, and also political will and political leadership in the course of the discussion. But I want to move over to Kosovo, and maybe you can speak a little bit about your work in the current context of what's happening in Kosovo.
I'm coming from Kosovo. Joy mentioned a couple of occasions. It's a small, very small country, hardly 2 million people, predominantly 95% Albanian, the rest were Serbs, Bosniaks, and some other very small minorities. During Yugoslavia, it was under Serbian Republic as an autonomous province, but constitutionally within the Yugoslav constitution. Also, not only when the war happened 98-99, that was a climax, but since the Second World War, I think the Albanians were treated as a third or second class citizens. The conflict that started in 98-99 upon Milosevic, who came to power, deteriorated very fastly. We ended up, or after the bombardment, I have to say that in this case, when international community realized that there is going to be another Srebrenica in Kosovo, then the intervention was much faster and harsher. So after the NATO intervention in 99, Kosovo was in a state of nature, limbo. No government, completely no leadership. In one side, the political leadership was in exile, while on the other, Kosovo Liberation Army, which was guerrilla army, was taking kind of control. So after the intervention, Kosovo was left with 13,000 killed, more than 6,500 missing persons, and completely institution out of order, with people traumatized, and sort of, while international community, UNMIC, UN, put on protectorate, Kosovo under protectorate. On the other hand, civil society should have, we actually, I was part of civil society, we had to start structuring ourselves and healing and working with large community of the victims and families of missing and killed. When I mention missing and killed, I don't mean only Albanians. Yes, predominantly there were 13,000 were mostly Albanians, but there are also other minorities. So what happens from 99, 2000 up to 2008, we were under protectorate. We are not anymore. But there is civilian oversight, international community oversight of how the government works and how we develop slowly. After the independence, after 2008, there are lots of initiatives and lots of, both in legislation but also in the part of civil society, how we start to tackle the mechanisms of the transitional justice and dealing with the past. It was not only tick box that we had to kind of implement or work in these mechanisms of dealing with the past. It was constitutionally obligations, because under Ahtisaari package, which created settlement for Kosovo independence, we are obliged to deal with the past and to reconcile. I'll stop here, and in next round I'll take the floor and discuss about the obstacles, the achievements, and where we stagnate, actually. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to move on to Lebanon. And I know you've been working with education, working with history, curricula, and syllabuses, and so on. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what you're doing in Lebanon against the sort of current backdrop in terms of what's happening there?
I'd like to start by announcing a big event in Lebanon. Is that last week we have elected a president of the Republic. And this might not sound really surprising to many of you, but for 2.5 years, Lebanon stayed without a president. And in the last few years, we also witnessed more than 6 months without a government. And in the last 10 years, we have witnessed a parliament renewing its own mandate twice. And each mandate lasts 4 years. And recently, the president was elected, but that parliament, considered by most of the Lebanese as illegitimate, illegal, but everybody agrees that it's great that we have now a president. And I'm really not very sure if this is indeed a historic step in our, and really a moment of our history where we will shift towards a lasting peace, or it is just a political maneuver that, like what we have been living, just to take power. And at this point of our history, we really don't know what is the direction that we will be following. As you know, all of you, maybe, we have lived a very long war, 15 years of civil war in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990. And the war ended with a political agreement that we call the Ta'if Agreement of 1990. The agreement did stop the guns, but like in many other countries that have witnessed wars, like in Sri Lanka, the guns are not sufficient. We stop the guns, but the violence takes different shapes, especially that after the Ta'if Agreement, a kind of amnesia was imposed on the Lebanese. We were asked to forget, and then eventually to forgive. And without any efforts for reconciliation, for addressing memory, for any accountability, no one was held accountable, in fact, for the Lebanese war. And as part of that agreement, there was agreement that there should be a national unified history textbooks as a step towards reunification of the different communities that were against each other during the war, and the way to rebuild the state. Unfortunately, 26 years after the Ta'if Agreement, we don't have that national unified history textbook. We still cannot agree, in spite of efforts done by the government. We have formed 4 committees over the last 26 years. They all failed to agree on basic issues. And today, our students don't know anything, our youth don't know anything about what happened, about our common history. History stopped for us with the independence of Lebanon in 1943. Beyond that, our young people don't know anything. And this might sound like expected in some conflict countries, but this means that for us, for our students, the Soviet Union still exists. And the Berlin Wall is still there, and the man did not reach the moon, and so on. So history stopped a very long time ago. And hence, my answer to you about our efforts as part of the Lebanese Association for History are geared toward raising this issue and making people aware of the importance of history. And I will stop here to talk about it a little bit further in the second round.
Thank you, thank you very much, Nela. Yeah, I think we'll return to the question of history, school curricula, and all a little later on. I suspect there would be a great deal of interest on the part of our Sri Lankan participants in terms of the way history is taught in our school. I know the University of Colombo some years ago tried to rewrite the history syllabuses, but that was not successful. I understand there's an initiative in this regard that's taking place right now once more. We'll also revisit the issue of political leadership and the link between political leadership and civil society activism. But I think that's a good transition to South Africa. So it's now 20 years since your new constitution, 2022 since the transition. What do you think South Africa has achieved in these 20 years in terms of democracy and equality?
Big question. I find it important, perhaps as a disclaimer, when I'm on a panel like this, as a white South African of German descent, to acknowledge that I'm a privileged white South African. So this is the position in which I sit here. I try not to speak on behalf of others, but I work for an organization that works on social justice issues. So that's the capacity in which I'm here. I also find it really striking listening to these three panelists and friends, how parallel many of the issues are, you know, whether it's the sense that the transition was imposed, or a sense that we're stuck, that there's a sense of amnesia about the past. All of the issues that have been spoken about, I think, transcend, and the four of us have had multiple conversations where it emerges that all four of the contexts that we represent, post-conflict situations, grapple with many of the same issues. And for me, that begs the question, you know, how are we going into the kind of transitions that we're seeing in the world 20 years ago, and I think now today as well. I'm not going to go into great detail about South Africa's past, because I think it's one that was a story that was well told. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which ran for a few years and then submitted its final report to the President in 1999. And like most Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world, we struggled with the implementation of the very ambitious recommendations of the report. And for me, that's one of the biggest challenges, and perhaps one we can talk about a little bit as well. This ambitious process, which ultimately results in very little tangible change for people who are direct and indirect human rights violations victims. Where is South Africa at today, 20 years after our transition, a transition which South Africans are incredibly critical of, rightfully so, I think. But I think what is very important is that the rest of the world start looking more at what South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the aftermath hasn't achieved. We need to start moving away, I think, from looking at the TRC as this perfect process and start looking at 20 years later, what does South Africa actually look like? And those of you who've been seeing, I don't know to what extent news about South Africa penetrates into the media here, but we're seeing massive uprisings at the moment, predominantly amongst youth from the universities around the country. And I'm not entirely sure how well the media is doing, and Kunda Dixit was referring to this earlier on, in terms of really telling the whole story of what is happening in South Africa. But the protests at home are really about decolonization. There is a big underlying element which is all about fees and access, but there's a profound sense from students that they don't feel represented by our tertiary education system, by the way materials taught, by the way material is generated, and so forth. And I think that is, for me, indicative of a broader historical trauma which exists but hasn't been acknowledged. So even though we've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've had remarkable civil society efforts, small organizations, bigger organizations who are involved in dialogue, in research. My own organization, for instance, and you can listen to my colleague Cindy in the next 2 days, who does very important work at a community level, but we're doing some quantitative research, monitoring the reconciliation process in our country. But there are a number of indicators that show that we're just really not moving in the right direction. This is particularly visible around human contact, and I think that's something that is very problematic in the aftermath of apartheid, where we had spatial apartheid, a country that was physically divided. This was part of the apartheid agenda. And so contact between different race groups in South Africa is still not made possible. And this inability for people across the race divide to physically engage in meaningful conversation and dialogue, never mind the day-to-days, I think is very restrictive. So I think what we're living in is a context in which there hasn't been significant enough acknowledgement and understanding of how apartheid has actually impacted us. And it's not just apartheid, it's colonialism before that and slavery before that. How have people's self-schemas been shaped by hundreds of years of oppression, and what does that do to how we engage with one another at the family level, at a community level, and at a national level? And I think that this history of segregation and oppression is mirrored in many aspects of our society. It's mirrored in very high levels of structural violence. We have some of the highest inequality statistics in the world. It's mirrored in the rhetoric in which government speaks to its people. So we are, I think, like the other countries that are represented on this panel, at a crossroads where we really need to make some very frank decisions about how we're going to move into the future.
Thank you very much. What we can do now is pause and maybe take a few questions from the house. If people have any questions or comments, or you want to ask something on Sri Lanka. Anyone got the urge to speak? Yes, please. Would you mind identifying yourself?
Amy Fagan from Massachusetts Beyond Genocide Center for Prevention. I have a question for the delegate from Bosnia. I have heard in the past that the education system is tiered, where the different ethnic groups are segregated into separate classrooms and taught different education processes and different historical aspects of the war and their own history. Is there any effort to move forward with some kind of a unified educational process so that, or actually, I mean, could you clarify that for the audience and elaborate, because I'm probably just presenting a very cursory overview of that, and what possibility is there for changing that structure?
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, we have that phenomenon. We're calling it two schools under one roof. It's not all over Bosnia. It's just in one part, central part of Bosnia. We're mostly Bosniaks, so it's Bosnian Muslims, and Croats, Bosnian Croats, are living. It's not that many of these schools. Most of the schools in Bosnia are like normal schools, let's call it that. We have very bad system of education, and that's a bigger problem, I think. But we have now, before it was around 40 of these schools. Now I think it's 16, which is much less. There is last year, because parents and many youth organizations, they are fighting strongly against that, and they engaged in process in the front of the court that lasted for several years. And last year's decision by the Constitutional Court in Bosnia was made that these schools are illegal, that they should be closed and banned, and that all the schools and the system should be united. However, in Bosnia, more than 19 Constitutional Court decisions are not implemented at all, and the local government or the state government or anybody in that country do not have any intention of implementing these decisions. For Bosnia, the Constitutional Court exists only because we have to have a Constitutional Court. But basically, decisions made by the court are not important. And people who are sitting in the court now we have 3 foreigners, and the rest are people who were active members of different political parties. And now they pretend that they are not anymore. Of course they are. It's not really possible to do it in that way. So there are efforts. There are some people working on the grassroots level who are trying a lot to influence public and to explain to them like what is happening if we have this kind of schools. Even more, like recently, group of pupils in one small city of Jajce, they decided that without parents, without anybody, kids went out on the streets and held protests for several days, asking for their school to be united. Response by the local government was that not only in Jajce now they will continue having, actually they will not have 2 schools under one roof, they will have 2 schools, totally separated in 2 separate parts of the town. So basically local government totally ignores what citizens want, and the international community that is still present there, they will always tell you, you elected them, so now you have to live with them. That is not really true, because in Bosnia even dead people are still voting, so it's not really that we elected them, but some dead people are electing these people. So yeah, there are some efforts, but at the same time, the people who are holding the power, who are corrupted politicians, political elite, they do not permit any kind of change that would finally lead us out of the status quo and the horrible situation that we are in, including educational system.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question? Yes, please. Very briefly, just to identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Menaka Vanderpoorten. I just wanted to know, just a point of information. You said it's a protectorate. So,
It's semi-protectorate.
okay, so how long is that situation supposed to continue for? And when you say the international community, who are the countries that are involved?
When I say international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's we have Office of the High Representative. Head of the Office of the High Representative is appointed by the EU. Deputy head of the Office of the High Representative is American. So that's the main organization. Then we have OSCE, this very strong presence of the OSCE. We also have NATO, that is very strong, and different embassies. Actually, there is one body called the Peace Implementation Council that is made out of 52 different embassies and intergovernmental organizations, including like NATO, including OSCE, including different, and that's international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Semi-protectorate means that we believe we believe that we are electing somebody there, and we believe that we are playing democracy. So every 2 years, every second year, we go and we vote. I stopped doing that this year. I will never do that again, to be very honest. I just don't believe in that kind of a system. But basically, people go, people vote, and then politicians, they basically they don't even meet in parliament for long time. Like sometimes they just go and meet basically to discuss about their salaries. And the international community is present there, and every little while they remind us that they're present there, and if they want, they can change that, but they decided not to do that because we will one day become EU member. One day. I know it's confusing, but it's really kind of like, it's status quo. And semi-protectorate means that we pretend that democracy exists in that country, and the international community support us in that pretending, and even more, they pretend it exists.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks. My name is Garrett Kurtz from King's College London. I have a question that probably all of you could somehow answer, but perhaps best Nadia and you, Nidara, can respond to it. You will see. I would like to know how can Sri Lanka learn, or other countries could learn, from your country's experiences with regard to overcoming and avoiding some of the mistakes that you described that were made after the war, in terms of the political fragmentation that was basically institutionalized, right, in the Dayton Agreement, those effects that you described, or in the Taif Agreement that you described, where there are incentives for politicians to appeal to their own communities. Yes, don't have that. That's the easy answer, but perhaps going a bit further than that. How do you overcome political fragmentation after war?
So maybe we'll take another couple more questions before I ask you to respond.
I'm Harsha Vijaysekara from Open University of Sri Lanka. I was wondering that when I was listening to all of you, that I would like to bring Sri Lankan context to this conversation. For example, our whole school system is completely segregated along the language, ethnicity, because of the media of instructions. For example, we have nearly 10,000 government schools. Out of them, we have only 34 multi-ethnic schools. Only 34. So, we are talking about reconciliation. I strongly believe education is the best tool for reconciliation. So I'm wondering why the government of Sri Lanka, along with the Ministry of Education, the bodies who are making policies on education, why they have not taken any, I don't see any such steps are being taken yet.
Thank you very much. Good question. Anyone else wants to make a final comment before I ask the panel to respond? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Damyong. I come from Timor-Leste, or East Timor. Maybe my question I would like to dedicate to the colleagues from the South Africa. As you mentioned that you also have this third commission for reconciliation. In my country, once after 1999, in 2001, we also established this third commission for reconciliation. And then this commission produced a lot of nice recommendation and sent to the government and to the president and to the UN agency. But at the moment, it seems like the implementation, we don't really see how this implementation look like. Maybe you can share with me and in the South Africa context, how this implementation of reconciliation that already been produced to the government or to the state. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do you want to go first, Nila? Do you want to respond at all to the education question?
I'd like to respond, yeah. It's a very interesting question, thank you. Because as you mentioned, we can learn a lot from the Lebanese experience, the Lebanese failure, in fact, even after the Taif agreement. Because the political agreement that ended the war resulted in constitutional changes, and thus sharing the power between Muslims and Christians considered after the Taif as 50%, 50%. And so now we have a complete division or in all public positions. 50% for Christians, 50% for Muslims. And at the time, those who conceived the agreement thought that this will lead to peace, since we acknowledge each other's share in a just way. However, the Taif agreement did not come with any accompanying reconciliation, any accompanying truth-seeking, and in fact, any efforts on behalf of the civil society to push for some kind of reconciliation at the national level, or even truth-seeking at the national level, or even commemoration of the war at the national level, or any form of dialogue among communities, was totally crushed. The Lebanese state completely refused to engage in any dialogue, any conversation about what happened during the civil war. There was kind of, and the movement was that we have the political agreement of Taif, and we moved immediately to sharing of power among warlords who it was thought that it is the best thing to do is to bring them into government, and this way we make sure that they are part of the country's governing, and this was devastating. Because what happened is that they started, now we have what we call an oligarchy in Lebanon. They are ruling the country and taking all its resources only to their own benefit, and we are suffering from this every day. So it's a different kind of violence. It's not anymore guns, but they are really totally forgetting about the people. The people are suffering from what's happening among the elite. And so, yes, a lot has to be learned. It's not enough to stop the guns. Today, our keynote speaker talked about nurturing the peace. You need to nurture the peace. And unfortunately, what happened in Lebanon is that only the civil society alone took that responsibility. A lot has been happening. I can say we have a very vibrant scene at the civil society level. But at the policy and national levels, we are not being able to break through. And this is something really that happens. It's not a unique case, but we have a lot to learn from also for other post-conflict societies.
If you want to come in.
Yeah, I would like to comment on two questions. The gentleman asked about any lessons learned. I don't think, at least Kosovo is not still, we just left the war or conflict, armed conflict 17 years ago. And there are lots of flaws into committing ourselves into implementing all these mechanisms of transitional justice. I mentioned we still have 1,700 missing persons. In that issue, for instance, something that just today, I know that Sri Lanka has far larger number of missing persons. You might think that for the size of Kosovo, 2 million, 1,600, 700 still missing is too small number or symbolic, but still to us is too big. Yet, these missing persons are well documented. Their bloody tissues are taken, and the families, when they find the bodies, they know exactly that their beloved ones were either killed or just was missing. Something that, yes, I have to, in Kosovo, for instance, ICMP and international organizations has done this identification of the bodies, but at least the bodies are well, they are documented, that the number of missing persons, we can't just guess how many and whether the persons were buried in proper way. What is contested, something it's political nature, when we still have this number missing and there is lack of information or lack of agreement between two sides, Serbs and Albanians, who don't want to provide information on who abducted, who killed them, who kidnapped them, and where their bodies are still. And in this case, both governments are to be blamed. In terms of school segregation, again, you know, theory says that transitional justice, we know where it starts, we don't know where it ends, and it can take, I don't know, decades, maybe century. 17 years after the armed conflict in Kosovo, we have very small minority, but still Serbian community, they learn from their Serbian curricula, from Serbian state. They don't accept national curricula for everyone. Albanians, they learned their curricula. Now, in grassroots level, communities don't communicate. And there is, maybe segregation is a harsh word to say, but still there is no community kind of, the societies are quite divided, and the Serbian community lives in enclaves. Now, we are impatient and we want things to move faster. We want both guys to learn the history of each other. And there are the others who have gone through, like Lebanon and other countries, who come and tell us it's a longer process and it goes slowly, but you have to be more patient because things are not changed overnight. So frankly speaking, I don't know what to say. I'm impatient for my society too, because I want things to move quite slowly, but it's only 17 years and we might, I don't know, maybe we should just work more and work hand in hand with all stakeholders, including government, not only one part of society. In Kosovo, I have to admit, whatever was done in terms of transitional justice, documenting war crimes, missing persons, it was done from civil society. Government wasn't very willing to deal with the past, and partially it's because we still have in power people who have dirty past, who have been heavily involved in either war crimes or organized crime.
You you want to come in on any of those questions? Do you want to respond to the Truth Commission?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to start off by disagreeing with the speaker on who was commenting on education. I think it's absolutely the only way we can proceed. But we also mustn't forget that an educated population changes voting patterns, and those voting patterns might not be in favor of the government who's running that country at the time. So these are difficult trends, I think. And in South Africa, 20 years down the line, if we had implemented, with all the resources we had at the time, an education system that was aimed at redressing the past, we would be at a very different stage now than where we are at, which is with over 50%, more or less over 50% unemployment, which is crazy. And for me, that sort of leads into the question on the implementation of the recommendations. No, they haven't been implemented by and large. We don't live in an environment where those, I don't know, Shirley, how many pages of recommendations? 50, 48? We have, and so for me, the question again, as I said earlier on, is looking at transitional justice in a new way. I think is really something we need to start doing. Stop looking at learnings and best practice. With all due respect, I think it's a great question, but let's ask different questions and let's engage on a slightly different way. Because what we're seeing at the moment in all of these societies is not progress, is not change, is not redressing the lives of victims and redressing human rights violations. And just to wrap up, we hosted a conference in Kigali 2 months ago on sort of the veracity and the efficacy of truth and reconciliation commissions. And we had all of the truth and reconciliation commissions on the continent represented, commissioners, academics, scholars, and so forth. And it was really quite striking how this issue of recommendations came up from every single country. So everybody said, yes, we had this process, and of course there's a huge amount of criticism as to everything from witness protection to judicial processes, amnesty process, and so forth. But ultimately, it's the issue around recommendations that is the most lasting, which to me is quite striking. And I think something that in South Africa is something that we really missed is creating a body, national or not, that was uniquely tasked with continuing to redressing human rights violations and redressing the past at a national level, perhaps similar to, and of course we have these bodies in countries like Rwanda here in Sri Lanka as well, and they're not perfect either, but certainly that's something I think that in South Africa could have played a role at moving, as somebody said earlier on, so the conversation from civil society being the ones who are leading these conversations to it happening at a more national level.
Thank you. So I want to move the conversation a little bit. Sorry, somebody else has a question? Christoph, you had something? Yeah, please.
Was about.
Okay, shall we let her respond?
No, and then thank you. So, lessons learned, I think, was the most important lesson coming from Bosnia, I think, for any post-conflict society is do everything opposite from what was done in Bosnia. But like everything, like literally everything. Like Bosnia is a country of 3.5 million people. We all speak the same language. We love to call it differently, even though even we cannot see the difference between our languages that we call differently. I call language that we speak in Bosnia our language. By purpose, I avoid to call it Bosniak, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, whatever. I call it our language. And I don't want to use any other term. It's our language, so you are happy or not happy. But unfortunately, schools are separated. How? Well, seems to be they're counting our blood, or like, I don't know, like how they can make, or like basically you can say I am Serb, I am Bosniak, I am Croat. But it's very changeable, you know, it's like imagine community. So today I can be Serb, tomorrow I can be Bosniak. I mean, I can play with that as long as I want, and many people who I find very smart do play with that. And that's what is good lesson actually. Play with them. If they want to play with your life, you should play with them. The second lesson, except this to do opposite from Bosnia, is, you know, after the war, the people who led the war, they signed the peace agreement. The international community decided that these people are their partners in written and in practice. They, not even politicians, local politicians, who are to blame for everything that is happening in Bosnia, not even the international community immediately after the war, they didn't want to ask people, what do we really want? And how do we see ourselves and our country? They just completely left us aside without even giving us a right to talk. Until 1999, it was forbidden by the international community to talk about the war in the broadcast media. And every media, I used to work for independent media and we ignored that, but it was forbidden to mention genocide, to mention aggression. Where the war was called, and OHR insisted at that, to call what happened in Bosnia, to call it unfortunate incident. It was genocide. 40,000 women were raped during that unfortunate incident. Some of them were as old as 12 years. The human trafficking in Europe started in 1992 in Bosnia with women who were raped, kept in the concentration camps, raped for several months, gang raped, and then sold to soldiers around the country to continue raping them. There was a rape camp in Bosnia. It's in the middle of Europe, in the city of Visegrad, called Vilina Vlas, that is spa today. Many people go there as a spa. Around 200 women were raped in that place. Only 4 body remains were found. We have no idea what did happen with the rest of these women. They just disappeared. And the international community did not allow us to talk about that until 1999. Unfortunately, we did not find, we were too tired of war back then to be able to impose what we want on international community, on local politicians, but we let them impose what they want from us. Even more unfortunately, today we are tired of peace. If you talk with kids in Bosnia today who are born after the war, and I teach at the School of Human Rights every year that is in Sarajevo, and I teach to kids who are now 60, 70, 80 years, so they don't remember, they don't know what the war was, what the war is. And when I ask them, do they believe we have a peace in Bosnia? But every single time, and I teach for 6 years, every single time, all of the kids in that group, and it's usually a group between 15 to 20 kids, they always tell me, no, we are still in a war. And that's the horrible picture of Bosnia. Nobody is shooting, but we are now tired of that kind of peace in which we don't have a voice, we don't have a right, we have no idea how to call our language, what our language is, what our identity is. We just have to live with that international community, whatever that is, and corrupted political elites who are basically hoping that tomorrow all of us will just disappear so that only dead people can continue vote for them and create and help them to remain that status quo and to continue living that kind of not life. Because what my life is Bosnia is I'm alive, but I cannot say that we do live normal life in Bosnia. I'm at the bottom of Europe, of humanity. I really, all of us live. We are humiliated on a daily basis in Bosnia. So do everything differently from what was done and what is happening now in Bosnia. That's the best and the most important lessons that anybody can learn from Bosnia.
Thank you very much. Yes, Christoph.
Christoph Fine, working with GIZ here in Sri Lanka. It's a bit difficult to directly link to some other aspects of our reflection here after these kind of bleak pictures that are being painted, and for good reasons they are as bleak as they are. I'm contemplating on 2 questions. The first one I'd like to address to Friederike, and the other question, if possible, to all of you. When reflecting on the process of reconciliation, there seems to be some guideline that is prevalent in the international discourse, and that calls for listening to people and their priorities. Not necessarily politicians, leading politicians, international communities, but trying to listen to people and their priorities, with a particular emphasis on those who have been direct victims of violence. Now, Friederike, South Africa, for long years, if I remember correctly, 10, 12 or even more years, has tried to systematically feel the pulse of South African people with what is called a reconciliation barometer, trying to find out what is it really that concerns people. Is it livelihoods? Is it justice? Is it reparations? Is it truth? What is it? Now, in how far has this attempt of feeling the pulse of people on a very regular basis, by way of a sound methodology, has been able to influence policymakers and shape the course of reconciliation? That's something that would be very interesting if you could share it with us. And the question to all four of you, the topic of our conference is arts in reconciliation. So I would like to hear from you in how far you feel that arts can play a constructive role in reconciliation. And we are well aware of the fact that favoring arts as a good tool in supporting reconciliation sometimes earns us the criticism that we are trying to play harmony, look at wonderful plays, listen to good music, some nice dances, but scratching the surface rather than coming to the substance that is necessary to be addressed. So we are aware of the criticism of emphasizing arts, but at the same time we see this enormous potential in arts addressing the unspeakable issues that others are not daring to address. So I'd like to know from your side in how far you feel that arts in your four contexts has played an important role in addressing crucial issues of reconciliation.
Thanks, Christoph. Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question. Perhaps I should just very briefly say that what Christoph is referring to is a quantitative tool which South Africa, or rather my organization in South Africa, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, has developed, which has since 2002 or 3, so many years, been quantitatively monitoring reconciliation trends in South Africa alongside a set of indicators which we've developed and also fine-tuned to our political situation over the last years. And it's available on our website. Many of you, I'm sure, know it. And it provides a very interesting annual overview of where South Africa's at in terms of everything from things like trust in institutions and government, to interracial contact, to perceptions of the other, to historical memory, about how people feel about apartheid, whether they feel we should still be talking about it. Please don't ask me to answer these questions, because it's not my project. I do believe very highly in it, and I think some of the data I do know, but you know, we release this data on an annual basis in a fairly high-profile way to the media, to the international community, to government. We produce a very glossy publication, like all good NGOs do. But my sense is, you know, sitting here in Sri Lanka and having a slightly more distant view onto South Africa, that there's very little real in-depth engagement with it. So most responses and real genuine interest in it will come from other civil society organizations, from international donors, from the international community operating in South Africa, but far too little in terms of the fact that we're actually providing really interesting, nuanced data on a silver platter to government and saying, this is the real state of South Africa, this is what the numbers are showing us. And I think that's paralleled and mirrored by sort of the grassroots work that we do and all of our civil society partners are doing. So, you know, in a nutshell, not at all, and we're definitely not generating the kind of traction. That's not to say that that we'll stop lobbying government and stop targeting the data that we generate at policymakers. I think there's value in continuing it, because we have longitudinal data, which is very rare, I think, and very, very important to see how trends then parallel with political developments, and it'll be very interesting to see at the moment, given where South Africa's at, how data sort of responds to that. But I think, you know, what's really striking to me is what you're saying about the importance of listening, And rather than telling people, and that's what Nijara is saying, rather than telling people what we feel they need, listening to them. And I think there's a profound sense at the moment that we haven't sufficiently listened to one another. And in my own work in communities around Cape Town, it's really striking to me how as soon as one engages in any space where there's an opportunity to potentially share historical narratives, how people are very, very keen to open up and to talk. And to the extent where people have said to me, you know, in an oral history project that we've been involved in, so it's all good and well that we're telling you our story, but we want to tell one another our stories, create the spaces where people can come together and share one another's stories and hear one another's pain, unite around people's pain. And that, for me, is what is very, very sorely missing in South Africa. And I'm getting a sense that this is something, there's an appetite throughout. So even though we, I think, have a fairly dynamic dialogue happening in the media, in independent media, between civil society organizations, we're not having them around the dinner table often enough. We're not having those bold conversations that are very painful and break families apart and break friendships apart. Or make friendships and reunite families. So I think, I mean, it's an interesting process, I think, and I'd much rather we look at that actually than continually keep looking back at the TRC as sort of an overarching. I think we need to look at these nuances and the things that do work. I'll stop there, but I do have some thoughts on the arts, because that's obviously why we're here. And even though I personally don't work in this field at all, I think something that strikes me is we in South Africa, I think, have a very vibrant musical art, dance, performance tradition. But from my own engagement in the city of Cape Town, it is still a very elitist and space. We're preaching to the converted. We have fantastic social justice theatre. Sometimes it moves out into communities, but by and large it doesn't. So you know, 2 weeks ago I attended a play that was produced by students who were part of the protest movements about decolonization and fees falling. But you know, it's in the city, in the evening, in a space that traditionally, historically, isn't particularly accessible to everyone, where people don't feel comfortable. And so, yes, great that we have that, but we really need to rethink this. We need to rethink things around access, preaching to the converted. I think Kuna Dixit was speaking about being more interactive. So it's all good and well, whether it's dance or performance. I mean, what struck me again this morning, listening to the drummers, is how similar our drums sound at home, you know, and there's such power in that. There's such power in the things that we share. And I think we need to become far more creative in creating what the German lady earlier on was saying, friendships around the arts and using the arts and using culture and these things that we feel quite passionately about and that aren't necessarily political, to unite around that. So, yeah, and I'm very excited over the next days actually to hear what monitoring and evaluation systems exist around the arts. So great, you know, last night we went to a fantastic opening of an exhibition that was part of this magnificent festival we're at here, but how are we tracking whether, you know, 10 dresses covered in anecdotal blood are actually impacting on the reality of domestic violence in Colombo? And I think that's what we need to start thinking about.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to come in on the arts? And I'm just wondering whether you can also talk a little bit about the idea of historical dialogue, because I know all of you have worked with this concept, and I'm sure there are people in the room who really don't understand and haven't worked with it before. So maybe a few words in terms of historical dialogue versus transitional justice versus post-conflict justice.
Well, this word historical dialogue, yeah, it sounds too academical and too academic. And if in case of Kosovo, I think we can call it dialogue, and currently it's quite imposed top-down from the international community. But historical, no, we have to remove that, because historically, somehow we have been, Kosovo Albanians and Serbs, at odds and in conflict. During Yugoslavia was different, but always kind of subordinated. After the independence, still we don't have a conflict, but there are completely lack of communication. And the dialogue, which is ongoing, it's still political. I don't like to talk about politics, but I have to admit it is there, because at the end of the day, politicians have legitimacy to bring changes. We do a lot of work in civil society. And even this historical dialogue, again, I would say dialogue that we try to do, we try to communicate, we try to build bridges with the other side in individual and community level, either by art or by documenting the past and trying to learn lessons and do better than, or take lessons from other societies, in this case, maybe French, German. In terms of, by the way, this doesn't mean that we are not moving on and trying to find the forms, the best forms, how to, that building bridge is a shorter process than sometimes it can take. In terms of, I'm going to finish this, in terms of the art, yes, again, we provided here maybe very gray, very dark part of, and it's a very short period of time that we reveal in front of you all the history of our countries. Because we deal in grassroots level, yes, art is, you can't escape. Through art is easier to bring people together, engage them. In the organization that I worked, we tried, as FIDE, definitely I don't work, art is not my part of, but it's the oral histories from the witnesses that we try to visualize them and bring them in national TVs in order for all ethnic groups to hear the stories of the victims or survivors, in order to dignify them, in order to just acknowledge their sufferings and what they have went through. I have to admit, Christoph, you made a very good question. I have to admit that there is a festival organized this year for the third time that really shocked us also positively, that brings together Serbs and Albanians when the Kosovar artists go to Belgrade and they perform, either singers or the actors. And it was really, it is still, and it will move on. It is really widely and greatly accepted by the public. It was at the beginning very difficult to convince the artists to go and perform in Belgrade. But once we have done 3 years ago, I think now they're looking forward to move on with the new opportunities. This year, we planned, but most probably we will do it next year. And there are a couple of organizations involved from Belgrade and Kosovo that are organizing this. There is idea to bring the Kosovo Philharmonic to Belgrade. No, Kosovo, some artists, yeah, no Philharmonic, but some artists from Kosovo to go and highly recognized artists to go and perform there. And I think they agreed, which was, I think, huge step to just convince them, go and perform there, and the next step will be how to bring Serbs to Kosovo. That will be a difficult task, but yeah, I think there is some positivity on this, and I've been part of it, really. In these activities, I also have to admit that we also bring very difficult topics in different debates, like missing persons or publications of different books that document the past, and we gather public from all sides in order to see the reactions. I think this is something very fresh that comes to my mind and is done between two countries, but in national level there are lots of rock concerts and activities that are ongoing, in particular in the north part of Kosovo, which is still contested and divided.
Thank you. Yes, so I think we have about 15 minutes more, is it? Or 15, 20 minutes?
I'd like to respond to a very interesting question about the art. Yesterday, in preparation for this panel, we were sitting together and thinking about the art scenes in our respective countries. And I can proudly say that Beirut is one of the most vibrant cities where you can find continuously theater productions, film productions, art exhibitions, book publications on daily basis. I could say on daily basis. And what is interesting is that, at least in the last 10 years, most of those productions addressed, one way or another, some form of the conflict in our society. And I could say addressed it critically. And the fact that we have in Lebanon a large space for freedom, intellectual freedom, and respect of freedom of speech allowed that. And art in all its forms is an expression of dialogue. There is a lot of conversation going on in any piece of art, whatever it is. And it can lead to building what was called in the morning as friendships, and I usually call as connections between the people. However, it seems to me that we are also there converting the converted. Most of the time in the theaters and the movies and the exhibitions and the libraries, we have the same people. Those who believe in dialogue, those who want to build a peaceful Lebanon, those who are working for it. And we're not being able to reach that other half of the society that is either ignoring it just because out of ignorance or out of no interest whatsoever, or another part that is still part of the very active as part of the protraction of the conflict itself in many ways. So if we are to think about Sri Lanka, and our participation in this conference, in fact, was somehow selfish, our participation, because we are here to learn too. It was very interesting to see that you have a conference on arts in reconciliation or for reconciliation, and we wanted to see what are we missing on, what can we do there. But for you too, you need to be aware of our experience, so that art leads to dialogue. Dialogue about the past, and with the past itself, question the past, and this is where it can be on the road towards reconciliation, much more than just an expression of an idea or a frustration or whatsoever, because it might also lead to more frustration in society, because as people become more aware of the issues, and they feel that they don't have the power to change, it leads to tension. So it's not enough. It needs to go into a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dela. Yes, please, go for it.
No, just talking about this, one other thing that I think strikes me now that I'm listening to this is that the idea that I think we do also need to decolonize art. And I think it's something we need to, this idea that art is something that appears in big, profound, often Western built buildings, that is exclusive and elitist, I think needs to be contested as well. And we need to start encouraging, and I think that's why the exhibition last night was so exciting, that there were young, dynamic artists representing what is happening in their communities, how they perceive things. But we need to, and I think that's where the corporate sector, for instance, comes on board. Government is very important to start pushing the conversation around art into a totally different sphere, where it is no longer elitist, where it is no longer inaccessible, where it is no longer something that is compared to, we stood in front of one of the pieces last night and thought of Picasso's Guernica, rather than seeing it as something in its own right, and sort of changing, I guess, the what we compare it and hold it to.
Sure.
In case of Bosnia, I think that at least, but I have to tell you that I'm talking from Sarajevo perspective, which is much different from the rest of the Bosnia. First of all, it's capital, and second, during the war, Sarajevo was under the siege, so the way of life we led was very different from many other cities around Bosnia. Being under the siege meant, in Sarajevo siege meant that 24/7 they were shooting at us from all the hills around the city, shooting at us with bombs and snipers, with anything that can kill. And I belong to the group of people who were lucky enough to survive. What helped us survive during the war in Sarajevo was actually art. Because even in the middle of that, and that was a nightmare, believe me, in the middle of that, we had very vibrant theater scene and movies. Sarajevo Film Festival, that is now today one of the most famous film festivals in Europe, was born in the middle of the war in 1994. And people, we used to go to places, shelters basically, to sit on the ground, to run through the fire, but literally doing this. I'm not like pretending this is not a movie. That's the way how we lived. Just to come and to watch a movie. We didn't have electricity, but we have a power. I don't know how you call it. Yes. And that was the way how to see the movie. And it was. We were extremely happy when Afonso Cuarón, who is like a Hollywood director, came in Sarajevo in 1994 through the siege, with the help of UN, and brought us his latest movie. Because the old movies that we watched during the war were old movies. And then he came with his latest movie. We felt alive. And it literally saved our lives. Also theater, music. And then I think many people, many very, very important artists around the world recognized how that is important for us. So Susan Sontag came to live in Sarajevo during the war. It's a small thing, but for us it meant a lot, because she didn't live in as some journalists used to come and to live in Sarajevo in very protected kind of like areas with the helmets, with bulletproof jackets and everything. No, Susan lived with us. She used to go, we didn't have water and electricity. She lived the same life as we lived. And it meant a lot to us. And in the middle of the war, what Susan Sontag done for us, she made a play, Waiting for Godot. And that was a huge thing. Until today, that's one of the things that we are talking. How much art means for people in country or in the city as Sarajevo. I find the proof even in something that happened just a couple of days before I came here. One director from Croatia, who is considered by some people, I don't find him very controversial, he made a play that church and imams in Sarajevo together tried to stop. The director of the festival that invited that play tried to obey what they asked him. And then something happened that doesn't very often happen in Sarajevo. When people heard over the media that the play will not be open for the public, but that will be only for the members of the jury, people went out on the streets. We got together, I was one of them, we got together in the front of the theater, but it was like literally very, very, very spontaneous. And we started chanting, we want play, we want theater, we want theater. And after 45 minutes, they let us in. And we saw it. So that's how important that is for us. And it is until today, and it was during the war, it was one of the safe zones for all of us. Today, Bosnia has one of the best writers in Europe, and they're given award by all over Europe. We have Aleksandar Hemon, that is one of the biggest writer now in the world. Bosnian film directors won all the prestigious film awards that you can find in Europe, plus Oscar and many other around the world. And they are writing and they are talking and they're even the singers, they're singing about the things that mainstream media very often do not consider, about the things that politicians don't ask to talk about. And it is a refuge and it is a safe zone for many people of Bosnia from war, from times of war until very, very today.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes left, I think. Maybe I can ask the House to respond if they have any comments or questions anymore. Anyone want to raise anything? Yes, please.
I would like to know what the censorship for the Bosnian films in line with the war. Like, is it freely available for them to make on their own stories, or is it being kind of restricted to talk about it? Like in Sri Lanka, what I've seen is like the best directors kind of bought by the government and, you know, the people, and, you know, they don't have much of a liberty of doing good like weight films with some conflict in it, and but, you know, they do certain up to a certain amount. So in your case, like, do you get some films, did any films come about in very good content, or how is it?
We have very good films. Luckily,
Towards war.
I'm sorry?
Towards war, the conflict which y'all had.
Yeah, I mean, no censorship. In the art area, no censorship at all in Bosnia. Luckily, it's the politicians do not see that. Then they don't recognize art as that important, so they just... And luckily, we are so poor that the state cannot give any money to artists. So most of the artists produce films or whatever they do with the help from money of the countries from outside, I don't know, wherever it is. And usually it's like joint production, sometimes even regional. So no, there is no censorship at all in that area. As I said, it is really a safe zone for all of us, if you have enough money to go and to see any of the plays. If don't, then you have no idea what is happening there. And if you don't have money, you will not buy a book, you will not go to theater, you will not go to any other places. That's the second problem. But
basically, yeah. Like if I'm in Bosnia, like, does that mean that I will be able to see the conflict you felt?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. You will be... Sometimes depends on what part of Bosnia and like of the current atmosphere in that part of Bosnia, but more or less you can see, I think, everything everywhere around, and even if not, you always have like a grassroots level organization that will find, like there was that famous movie about that won many awards also about the rape during the war in Bosnia, and it was shown in one part of Bosnia. In another part they try not to show it, but then what some people done, they played it in their homes and they invited everybody to come and to watch. And people were going, and that happened a couple of years ago, so not even during the war. So, but yes, you will be able to find, you will be able to read about that in books written by the local authors, to see many movies, and to see theater plays that are really, really, really engaged very often, and they are talking about what did happen during the war or after the war in this nightmare that we are living now.
Yeah, so we can take one or two more questions before I ask the panel to conclude. Yes, please.
I have a question here.
Sorry? Yeah, we've just got one in front, and then I'll come to you.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't mind if you go first.
It's okay. Growing up through the Canadian education system, I personally haven't been taught about Aboriginal peoples and the plight that Aboriginal peoples have gone through. The only history that we were taught was the history of the white settlers. The only mention of Aboriginal peoples was during the War of 1812. After that, we didn't learn anything. It was only recently that the education system started including the histories and the narratives of the Aboriginal communities, about colonization, about the residential school systems, about all of that. This was the past few years that this happened. Now, history is often written by those in power. A lot of times, the perpetrators of violence, the winners, the victorious, and it's often that the voices and the narratives and the stories of the marginalized, of the oppressed, are not reflected in these histories. And I know some of you have already talked about this, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the steps taken within your own countries, within your own context, to include these missing narratives, these missing stories, and these whitewashed, histories.
Yeah, can we just take a couple more questions and then I'll get you to respond.
Sure, it's quite difficult to pick up the conversation, but let me just try here. Firstly, we've been talking about art and education. And one of the things, a shortfall of all education systems globally is the lack of subject and teaching of art to young people. It seems as a God-given gift, and only a few people can make art, whereas I believe completely to the contrary. As I work with victims in the South African context, have done for 16 years, and everyone produces beautiful art. And this notion of art and artist, I think, has to be demystified. We've had a series of conversations here where there's political dysfunction. So how can we talk about this reconciliation in these spaces? Unsafe spaces, even South Africa perhaps wasn't mentioned, is that the ruling party is cracking, is splitting. And so then a third point is dialogue. Do we understand what this means? Because a lot of the art and the dissident art, which I think is the more popular around, that expresses the marginalized voice and the need for the marginalized voice to be heard by the supermasters, the elite in power. This seems to be the common narrative here. And do we live with this? There is money for the arts, but it's going towards the status quo. It's going towards the big projects that make you feel good temporarily, but not necessarily any deeper. How do we engage in proper dialogue? And how can art actually stimulate dialogue, that it's not the product, and it's how art is taken further beyond its modality to stimulate that conversation. I think those are the things that is critical to this conversation.
Thank you very much. Yes. Anyone else from the back of the room who hasn't spoken and would like to ask a question or make a comment? Okay, please.
I have one quick question about, actually for all of you. How do your countries incorporate access to the traditional arts? And do you utilize traditional arts, sacred arts, religious arts for exploring the expression of historical narrative of mass atrocity crimes? Because we all have traditional arts backgrounds dating back to prehistory, and I haven't heard any exploration of that at all from this group.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to also conclude. Maybe you can make this your concluding comments, because I think we have to wrap up. But I just wanted to also direct your mind to one thing, which is whether you could also just share some inspiring stories or anecdotes in terms of your own work, which perhaps can also contribute to the debate here on sort of dealing with the past and, as you called it, nurturing the peace.
I'd like to respond, in fact, to your question and to the gentleman's question, and maybe I can address yours on the way. It's very interesting that you bring up the Canadian experience. In fact, not only in Canada, if you take the United States and many other developed countries, you have what we call the one narrative, the consensual narrative. And to have in history a consensual narrative in the textbooks used at schools, it means that you are giving up a lot of the histories of the people. not only the marginalized groups, but the history itself. It's like simplified into one agreed upon narrative. And this is not the nature of history. And usually this one unified narrative is imposed on students. And students are only required to learn that story and to give it to you one way or another. What we are doing, and this is to answer you, at the Lebanese Association for History, and if I may say, here between brackets, we are an NGO that started as a grassroots movement among teachers, teachers who refused the status quo. We refused really the deadlock imposed on us at the policy level, where we teach a curriculum that was conceived in the 1940s. And so with the mind of the 1940s, where we only teach the political history, and the history of those who won the wars, the World War I and World War II, and who drew the map of the history of the world. So we are refusing this. And what we're doing is we are training teachers across the country to advance a disciplinary approach in history education. And by that we mean to follow the steps of real historians who look at evidence, analyze evidence, draw conclusions, compare and contrast narratives, bring in the different histories of relating to a certain period or event and so on. So we want our students, as of the very early ages, to start thinking at a high level and be analytic about history itself. And then it will talk. And then it is only if we do that that we prepare our students to become older adult people who can engage rationally in any reconciliation and any dialogue. How can you dialogue if you don't analyze, if you do not listen, if you do not study evidence, if you not compare? And so we're trying through changing pedagogy in history classrooms to change the thinking and to prepare our students to be responsible citizens later. And this is where we go back also to questions raised earlier about schools or learning from each other. I think it's important for Sri Lanka because I am aware that in Sri Lanka too, students at school level do not learn about their civil war. They do not know anything about it. And it's the same in Lebanon and in many other places. But there are post-conflict societies which have tried the disciplinary approach, and it's succeeding. Even if the process is slow, it is on the right track. And I could here highlight the experience of our neighbors in Cyprus, where also as an effort initiative from the civil society, they have been building a curriculum that is done by academics and history teachers from the Turkish Cyprus and the Greek Cyprus, if I may use those terms, and where they put the histories of the people on both sides of the border. And this is proving to because they're documenting it, and it's a very interesting experience by the AHDR. It's proving that they are being able to build slowly an understanding of, a wide understanding of what took place in the past, the conflict that existed, and why today their nation is in two countries. So there are examples from the world, and there are possibilities if we aim at thinking critically. If we aim at imposing one story, we fall in the danger of recurrence of violence, even if the cycle is long. Thank you.
Would you like to go next?
Well, prior to coming to this conference, the initial idea was that I'm going to learn more than to say anything about art and reconciliation, because definitely that is not something that I have done. And I believe that people should be very innovative and also artistic, and they should find the ways how to express their feelings. But coming from society which says, or majority of people will say, no forgiveness, no forget, but we move on, then I was thinking, let me go and see how Sri Lanka's, how they move on, what inspires them to link art and reconciliation and how they express themselves. Because definitely this is not my strongest side, though, as I said, we try to do it, and there are different initiatives that brings people together. But it's such a mess. In one hand, there is no desire for reconciliation. On the other hand, you see that people get together and they organize things together and they enjoy art, being drama, being painting, being communicating, being festivals, whatever. So there is no evaluation, there's no conclusion from me here. I'm not to conclude. I'm here to learn from you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Frederica?
People, so I'll just keep it very, very short. Amy, was it? You should chat to my colleague Cindy, who's sitting over there in red and purple, because she does work on exactly what you're talking about in South Africa, and I can't summarize it, so maybe you can catch a tea break together. Just very quickly on the issue of history education, we've done a little bit of work on putting together some of the sort of earlier materials that include narratives that have been invisible, not even just they haven't been there, they've been gone. And something that we've found very difficult is to work with teachers. So it's all good and well to have the materials, but you also need to work with the teachers to make sure that they can teach these things, because in many cases they themselves are so affected and have their own experiences. So it's a really, it's noble, but it's also really, really difficult. And I don't have concluding remarks. I like what Nora said, but I heard a lovely quote just recently. I was at a conference in the US, and an African American woman who does work in the slums in Denver said to me, or said as her closing remarks, that we need to stretch our imagination into the people we are engaging with. And I really like that, because I think it requires us to not just engage on a superficial level with one another and with the people that we work with, but to really try and imagine what others have experienced and have been through. And I think that pertains to the arts, but also just to our daily interactions with other human beings.
Thank you. Yes, Sundara. It's all right. You have the last word.
Thank you. First, I just want to say that, I'm a journalist and I'm activist. I don't work for NGO. I'm not engaged in that sector, which is obvious in the way I'm talk. I don't use the word reconciliation. I don't believe in that term, first of all, because it was imposed in Bosnia, as well as the term transitional justice. So I consider both as just two imposed terms that I really don't understand what they are. Reconciliation, personally, I think is something very personal. So you, by yourself, have to decide, do you want to reconcile with something or somebody or not? If you don't, it's also your right. What I believe in and what I hope is that we can build in Bosnia and in everywhere around in post-conflict societies, where memory of culture or culture of memory exists. That the society can be ready to cherish its memories and to find a way how to remember and how to deal with the things. And then it will help to people to decide if they want to reconcile, they don't want to reconcile, if they want to go, whatever, if they want to go back to war. If people decide that, if they want, I will leave, but if they want, for me, I don't care. And just one very, very, very short remark about the traditional art in Bosnia, and that's something very interesting, and I'm personally, it's not related to the past at all, but I personally follow what is happening in that field. LGBT community in Bosnia, that is still very oppressed, is coming out using traditional art, especially Serdalinka, that is all traditional Bosnian song. And it's a huge problem because the conservative part of the society is fighting against that, telling them that LGBT community cannot even sing traditional songs, and they're fighting them back, singing it. And not only LGBT, but what is happening, like Bosnian Sevdalinka is very related to one particular community, and that's Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim. So now you have Serbs singing Bosnian Muslim traditional songs. And these Serbs, there is one very famous one, it's Božo Vrečo, plus he is LGBT. And that's a real revolution that he is doing, and that's the revolution that, and many people support him, and he's so great in what he is doing, and he's doing it in such a beautiful way that not even the most conservative part of society can do anything against him. So that's something that I hope that every society will find the strength to come out of all the troubles and all the problems and all the conflicts, that the people will just find a way to come out and just to push away all the obstacles and to find their own way, as this Božo Vrečo found it through the traditional songs, dressed completely in women dress, and like, as he said, it's his dress, not women, so I'm sorry I use it in that way. But that's a struggle that many people follow, that many people recognize, and many people support.
Thank you very much. That's a powerful example on which to end this panel discussion. I want to thank the panel for sharing their thoughts this afternoon, and also to the audience for participating in your questions. So could you join me in showing your appreciation to the panel?